Well, hello everybody for this episode of our discourse about history, about ideas, people, and how these ideas and people have influenced us today. Today I'm going to focus on a particular person who uh, is more or less unknown in the United States, and that's fascinating because he was extremely important to the history of the United States. His name was Colonel Edward Nichols, and he was a military officer. He was a Royal Marine, and he fought against the United States in the so-called War of 1812. And so he started out by fighting against the United States around 1805, fighting against Napoleon and Napoleonic Wars, and then fighting against the Americans around 1812, and then fighting in Canada. And then he continued to fight into the teens. And his idea was that he must help, he really must help African Americans be free. He must also work to end slavery in the United States. Now, most of us think, well, we never heard about the War of 1812 having to do with slavery. Well, it did. It had a lot to do with it. And so he and his superiors, Lord Cochrane and others, got this idea that they could slow down the Americans in the Chesapeake Bay and elsewhere by basically confusing the Americans and also freeing thousands of captives in the Chesapeake region. And so one of his ideas was, if we capture so-called runaways, we can free them. This is our duty, our God-given duty. So I'm very happy today to have with me Pedro Enrique, my assistant, who comes from a country in which the British interference in the slave trade is in a way, very famous. The British were very active in Brazil, trying to stop the slave trade. They were also active in North America. The problem is, in North America, they won and they lost. And so we have this weird situation in North America where the British won big time. They won a lot. Canada is not part of the United States. The United States tried to conquer Canada, which is bigger than the US, and it failed miserably. However, Alabama and Mississippi and Florida are parts of the United States. And so it ended up being more or less a draw. Colonel Nichols fought in Florida, and he continued to fight there. And he eventually would not go home. And that's what's interesting. As he was being pushed out of Florida, he said, "I won't leave." And his superior said, "Well, you have to leave. We made a treaty with the Americans. You have to go back to Britain. You have to give up. We keep Canada, and the Americans keep Florida and Mississippi and parts of Georgia and parts of Alabama." He wasn't happy, but he did obey his superiors and he left. So for 6 years after the war was over, he was sort of on punishment. He was in a very strange place. He was thanked by his government, which gave him a cash reward. It gave him a very elaborate sword studded with diamonds. It gave him a commendation from the government, from his government, but it would not go to war again over Florida. And he couldn't get his government to go to war again. And eventually he was, in a way, punished, and this is complicated. he was sent to an island, which is the top of a volcano. The island is called Ascension, or Ascensão. It was a Portuguese discovered island in the South Atlantic. And there were no people on it, and there were no animals on it, except large sea turtles. And so Nichols stayed there in this very strange place. No water, no trees, a kind of prison. But he stayed there for 6 years. And then eventually, in the 6th year, he returned to England. And he sort of was, in a way, forgiven. It's a very strange situation. His government said, well, you're welcome back. You can come back to England. We know that you perhaps not well treated. And he was given a new position, which was governor of Fernando Po. And most people in England had never heard of Fernando Po, never heard of him. And so, what is Fernando Po? Is it a person? Why is he getting all these strange posts? Post is a military post, a job. And so what happened was, it is an island. Fernando Po is an island off the coast of West Africa. And it's about 30 miles from Nigeria. It was 30 miles from the main centers of the Atlantic slave trade. And so he convinced his superiors, the officers around him, that he could stop the slave trade by sailing up and down the coast and freeing the slaves and bringing them back to the island of Fernando Po. And so this he attempted to do. He had some success, and then he had a lot of non-success. People need food, so how is he going to feed these people? Because he's going out capturing slave ships and bringing them to the island of Fernando Po. And then also the question is, does he have a right to do this? And so the British said, okay, we have a right to do it. We have a treaty with the Portuguese. We can force them to take people to Fernando Po. We have a treaty with the Spanish. We can force them to take people to Fernando Po. And we have a treaty with the French. The problem was there was no treaty, again, with the United States. So this led to all kinds of tensions and disruptions. But Nichols said, I'm going to do this legally or illegally. And this was the problem. He kept picking up ships. He kept freeing people. But you needed law to do that. And the United States said, we will make no law which infringes on the freedom of the seas, which is the United States right. So Nichols stayed on Fernando Po throughout the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, and eventually was recalled. That is, he was called back to England. He was told that he was spending too much money, that he was not stopping the slave trade. He was injuring it. And then that what he should do is stay in England, work for good causes, but stay away from these grand plans. So he's called back to England, and then he came up with a great scheme. It's one of the most beautiful ideas you can think of. Because now he's in his mid-40s, he's sacrificed a lot of his life. And so now, more than any other white man in the tropics, he has the final solution to the misery of the slave trade. So in 1841, he gets his government to promise to stop the slave trade by sending steamships up the Niger River, sending brand new steamships with quinine, with soldiers, with dedicated crews, and sending them up the Niger River. And as they go up the Niger River, they can interdict, is the word they use. Just like the cocaine traffic, they can interdict the traffic, and that's the word they use. Now you talk about cocaine. So they go up, they interdict the traffic, stop it. And they're very proud of themselves. They're very self-righteous, that they're God's people. Look, they can do this with very little money. And the ships go up and they stop this evil, evil slave trade. And they begin to pat themselves on the back. These evil Americans, these evil Portuguese, these evil French, these evil Spanish. But as they go up the Niger, and they keep saying the idea is if they go up the Niger River, they can encourage Africans to raise cotton, tobacco, and sugar. It's wonderful. It's just wonderful. It's magic. And that the cotton that's grown in Mississippi will have to compete with the cotton grown in West Africa. The sugar that's grown in Brazil will have to compete with the sugar raised in Brazil. So Brazilian sugar will have to compete with West African sugar. And then cotton in the American South will have to compete with cotton produced in West Africa. And it's this wonderful idea. And he's very full of himself, and the government gives him a lot of money. Queen Victoria meets him. She is the patroness of this. She comes and meets him. She gives him a pile of money. And then in 1841, ships sail out from England with this great idea. And several months later, they steam in to the muddy, dirty, turbid entrance, the mouths of the Niger. It's very dirty. It has various mouths. For a long time, no one knew where the mouths of the Niger were. They're called the oil rivers. But eventually someone said, well, we found the principal mouth. And so as they sail into one of these mouths, they go up and up and up. And this connects to another mouth and another mouth. And soon they've passed most of the danger, and the British ships, which have been specially built, go in and began to trade European products for sugar, European products for iron, European products for cloth. But there's one problem, and this is common sense. There's a city called Abo, which I think the leader of Abo is really smart. And the leader of Abo says, wait, just stop. I'm quite willing to sign a treaty of trade with Great Britain. I'm willing. And I'm willing to trade palm oil. And I'm willing to trade sugar. And I'm willing to trade a number of other products with Great Britain. But this is about business. This is not about old sad stories. So I'll put my ex on a treaty, but in return for this, you have to guarantee me so much profit per annum. I have to be paid a certain amount of money per annum. And so the British say, of course, we will, Your Majesty, the King of Abo, we agree. And so the British go away with their treaty, they go back to Britain. They're very self-satisfied with themselves. In about 9 months, they come back. And the leader, the African leader, who was powerful, they go back and he says, wait, there's a problem. You said you'd be back, in 6 months, and now it's been like 9 months. This was not part of our agreement. And also, I've actually lost money. And they say, yes, you have lost money, but we want some, we want to buy your palm oil, etc. And he basically says, I don't think this is a very good business venture. He also points out something that they can't get around: mortality. That the British began to die in great numbers. Africans survive on the Niger. So we have most of the African traders surviving, but you don't have the British surviving. So many of them die And so this creates a whole sort of problem. Can you get British sailors to sail up to a place if they know they're probably going to die? Is the price of their lives worth the price of the product? And many of them begin to say this is not a very, very good business enterprise. And then they begin to say, look, why don't we try to get something else that we can trade? And basically, the Africans said, we don't care what you're trading. I mean, we will work with you if you work with us. But we need to trade on, first, we need to have equality of trade, and you don't seem to be interested in equality of trade. Number two, we are not going to be the junior partners here. We want to really get in a trade where we are equal partners, at least. Time goes on, and the Niger trade, the Niger palm oil trade, begins to get rocky. The British began to strong arm African leaders and tell them what they must do in terms of the palm oil trade. It does not work out. It is not a good trade. And so there's jostling, there's some violence, and gradually the British begin to strong arm the African kings. When I say strong arm, what I mean is they begin to go in and insist on certain tariffs, certain rights, and this is highly injurious to the African trade. Most of the Africans don't want to be forced to engage in any kind of trade. And so as time goes on, the British become more insistent. The British become more threatening and to use what we call gunboat diplomacy. And Nichols had always been saying, trade is love and peace. And if you have love and peace, people will understand each other. They will. But as time went on, the love and peace did not work out so well. This peaceful trade did not happen so well. And so there were skirmishes, and there were situations in which the British began to take African leaders into prisons, began to punish them, began to remove African leaders, and gradually take control of African cities like Lagos, which they did in the early 1850s. They actually began to take cities on the coast. This persists in the 1850s and 60s, and this leads, very unfortunately, to something that Nichols did not want. He died in 1865. A very sad man, because when he's dying, he realizes that what he's doing is preparing the way for imperialism, that the British are going in and claiming territory, which is something that he had always insisted he did not. And now we have some questions to finish up.
For the first question, I would like to know what were Nichols' motivations?
Basically, it was this idea that the modern world, which was just beginning, would move along because of business, because of money, but money in a good way. But commerce, in other words, people would sell more and more products, they would produce more and more products, and that all parts of the world would participate, and all colors of people would participate, and that this would be based upon cash, not coercion, so that the old regimes where people were beaten and whipped to work would be replaced by new regimes in which people would depend upon wages, and wage labor would replace forced labor. This would be the brave new world.
The second question, are we better people than back then?
I think we are. I think that since the time of Nichols, we've seen more violence, we've seen horrendous mass violence, we've seen Holocaust, not only in Europe, but Holocaust in East Asia, South Asia, Central Africa. But at the same time, we are aware. We actually feel in a way that perhaps people earlier did not feel. So that there's one theory, and I'm not a literature person, and I'm not in love with literature, but someone has pointed out that with the growth of the novel in the 1700s and 1800s, where people could actually read a book and read about someone else's life and read about how these people suffered, and then feel, on the basis of a book, feel empathy. Now, sometimes it's got very, very sentimental, as with Goethe, where he's actually writing to make people cry along with the person he's writing about. You're actually supposed to cry and feel that deeply. That is a bit exaggerated, romanticism. But most of us can now look at suffering in the world, in a group, and say, this is wrong. Whereas maybe 500 years ago, people couldn't do that.
For question number 3, is there anything particularly special about Nichols?
Yes. I mean, there are many things. First, he lived to be old. He lived to be extremely successful, having had a life in which he was in debtor's prison a little bit, in which he was cast off sort of on desert islands almost. So he had this eventful life. But he had over 100 military engagements. So he was engaged in fighting over 100 times. And as a result of this, he came out to be a man with almost no face. That he was missing probably an arm, a hand. He'd been hacked in the middle of his chest with a saber. He had a long scar down his face, and he was missing an eye. So he was a man with half a mouth, half an eye. People described him as disfigured. And he was this way probably from, it's cumulative, probably from his 30s. And remember, he lived into his 80s. So without antibiotics, without modern medicine, he was able to survive a long time in great pain and in great peril, and actually do a very good job. I'm amazed. I want to thank Pedro Henrique, our very able editor and questioner. I want to thank all of you for watching this, and hopefully we will continue this journey with questions, some questions fairly low-key, and some questions as we get into sex, sexuality, and identity that are going to be hot. Thank you.